Get out of the vehicle, hands where I can see them. The flashlight beam pierced directly into the old man's eyes. The aging pickup truck had just stopped at the police station entrance at midnight. Sweat trickling down his face, he simply opened the truck bed and said, "I'm just returning what doesn't belong to me." A high-pitched alert sounded across the yard. Minutes later, military SUVs silently surrounded the building, their dark shapes emerging from the night. "Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened." Raymond Nash was 78 years old, a solitary figure living in a small rural home that bordered the eastern edge of Texas. His weathered hands bore the calluses of decades of honest labor. His eyes, the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen more than he ever spoke about. The locals knew him only as Old Man Briggs, a fixture in the community who kept to himself but never failed to nod respectfully when passing others on the road. For almost 60 years, Raymond had driven the same GMC pickup truck, a 1962 model that had somehow survived from another era, just as he had. The faded blue paint, the cracked leather seats, the engine that announced itself from half a mile away, all were as familiar to the residents of Mill Creek County as the courthouse clock tower or the old oak on Main Street. Children in town had nicknamed it the war truck for its battle scars and antiquated design, though none understood the profound truth behind their innocent label. Every Tuesday and Friday, residents would see Raymond drive through town to purchase his sparse necessities. Always the same items, always paid for with exact change, always with minimal conversation. He wasn't unfriendly, there was simply an economy to his words, as if he had learned long ago that speech was a resource to be conserved, like ammunition or fresh water in the field. On this particular Tuesday evening, with twilight settling over the horizon, Raymond performed an unusual ritual. After decades of routine, he was breaking pattern. Inside his modest home, he carefully wrapped a small object in soft cloth, placed it in a hand-carved wooden box, and secured it with a simple brass lock. His movements were deliberate, reverent even, as if he were handling something of immeasurable value. Next to the box he placed a handwritten letter, the cursive script betraying the slight tremor that had developed in his right hand over recent years. The envelope was addressed simply, Precinct 17 Police Department. The letter inside read, "Deliver this to Precinct 17, don't let anyone else touch it." Raymond placed both items on the passenger seat of his truck, started the familiar rumble of the engine, and began the 40-mile journey into the county seat. He drove without radio, without companionship, just the mechanical symphony of an engine that had accompanied him through most of his life. At the county line, Raymond encountered a security checkpoint, unusual for this quiet stretch of highway, but not entirely unexpected given recent border concerns. A young officer, perhaps no more than 25, gestured for him to pull over. Raymond complied, bringing the aged vehicle to a stop beside with its flashing lights. "License and registration, please," the officer requested, shining his flashlight briefly into the cab. Raymond reached slowly into his pocket, retrieving a wallet as worn as everything else he owned. From it, he produced a driver's license, so faded that the photograph was barely recognizable, though the expiration date was still valid. The officer examined it skeptically. "What brings you out so late, Mr. Nash?" "Police business," Raymond replied, his voice carrying the gravely texture of age and minimal use. "Police business." The officer's tone shifted to suspicion. "Mind if I take a look in your vehicle?" Raymond's hand moved protectively toward the wooden box. "What's in my truck isn't for curious eyes, son. It's for Precinct 17, and only Precinct 17. The officer's hand instinctively moved closer to his holster. "Step out of the vehicle, sir. I need to check the contents of your truck." "I can't let you do that," Raymond said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't ordinary cargo." Within minutes, 2 additional patrol cars arrived. Raymond found himself surrounded by officers, their stance suggesting they viewed him as something he had never been in his long life. A threat. "Last chance, sir. Exit the vehicle and consent to a search, or we'll have to detain you." Raymond looked at the young faces surrounding him, saw the mixture of authority and uncertainty in their eyes, and made his decision. He would not compromise a promise 47 years in the keeping, not even now. "I believe you're making a mistake," he said quietly, "but I won't resist." As officers approached with handcuffs, Raymond's thoughts weren't on his own dignity, but on the box that contained something far more precious than his freedom, a symbol of honor that had waited decades to return home. "If you believe a good person deserves to be remembered, please stay with us." The Precinct 17 station buzzed with unusual energy for a Tuesday night. Word had spread quickly about the elderly man in custody, a potential smuggler, some whispered, or perhaps someone suffering from dementia. Officers processed Raymond through the system with efficiency that bordered on indifference, taking fingerprints from hands that had once performed far more crucial tasks than they could imagine. The booking officer noticed something unusual as he recorded Raymond's information. The old man's fingerprints triggered a peculiar response in the system, not a criminal record, but some kind of specialized security flag that the officer had never encountered before. He mentioned it to his supervisor, who merely shrugged and suggested they continue with standard procedures, while they waited for the system to clarify. Captain Monroe, the night shift supervisor, observed from behind the glass partition of his office, as Raymond sat stoically on the metal bench, showing neither resistance nor concern. Something about the old man's demeanor troubled Reynolds, the quiet dignity, the apparent lack of fear or confusion. This wasn't the typical profile of someone caught breaking the law. "Who called this in?" Reynolds asked the desk sergeant. "Checkpoint at County Line, sir," said the old-timer was acting suspicious, refused a vehicle search, claimed he had police business, but wouldn't elaborate. Reynolds studied Raymond's posture, the straight back, the hands placed precisely on his knees, the patient gaze that seemed to look through rather than at the bustling station around him. 23 years in law enforcement had taught Reynolds to recognize military bearing when he saw it. Meanwhile, Officer Delgado and his partner had brought the wooden box and led her into the evidence room, donning gloves before carefully examining what they'd seized during the vehicle search. "Strange construction," Tanner noted as he studied the box, hand-carved, probably decades old. His partner pointed to invisible markings along the bottom edge. "There's something here, looks like it was stamped, then sanded down." With proper authorization logged, they opened the brass lock, lifting the lid to reveal the object inside. Their confusion was immediate and profound. Nestled in the velvet lining was a military insignia of remarkable craftsmanship. It bore distinctive markings unlike standard military decorations, a specialized unit emblem with an encrypted serial number along its edge, and an official seal that neither officer recognized from their training. "This looks military but different," Tanner said, photographing it from multiple angles without touching it directly. High-ranking too, judging by the design. His partner had already opened the letter found in Raymond's truck. "Listen to this. The bearer entrusts to Precinct 17 the original insignia of Echo Shadow Unit, retrieved from Firebase Horizon, Vietnam, 1975, to be returned to rightful military authorities upon confirmation of Protocol Silverline. May those who fell be remembered. May those who wait find peace." It's signed by Colonel Nathaniel Nash, USMC, retired. "Related to our guy out there?" Tanner asked. "Must be. Look at this." He held up Raymond's identification next to the letter. "Same last name, but this Colonel Briggs. I've never heard of Echo Shadow Unit." "Have you?" Tanner shook his head. "We should run this through the system." Captain Monroe had already summoned Raymond to his office for questioning. The elderly man sat across the desk, his posture military straight despite his years. "Mr. Nash, we've examined the contents of the box you were transporting," Reynolds began, studying Raymond's face for reactions. "Care to explain why you're carrying what appears to be military property, possibly of significant value?" Raymond met the captain's gaze without wavering. "I'm returning it to where it belongs." "And why bring it to a police station rather than a military base?" "Protocol Silverline stipulates civilian authority as first contact," Raymond answered, using terminology that appeared nowhere in standard police training. Reynolds leaned forward. "You could have avoided all this trouble by simply explaining yourself to the officers at the checkpoint." A sad smile crossed Raymond's weathered face. "Some promises require discretion, Captain, even when it's inconvenient." "So you're related to this Colonel Nathaniel Nash?" Reynolds asked, tapping the letter. Raymond's eyes briefly reflected something deeper than the conversation. "Perhaps grief, perhaps pride. I've never needed titles to do what's right." The captain was about to press further when Officer Delgado knocked urgently at the door. "Sir, we just ran the insignia through the system," he said, his voice lowered. "It triggered some kind of alert. We've received a priority communication from the Department of Defense. They're instructing us to secure the item and the individual and not to proceed with any further questioning." Reynolds frowned. "On whose authority?" "Joint Chiefs level." "Sir, the message specifically states, do not handle the box contents. The individual in your custody is a former commanding officer of Shadow Echo Unit. Military representatives are en route." The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. Raymond Nash, the quiet old man with the ancient pickup truck, had just been acknowledged by the highest levels of military command. Whatever he carried was significant enough to mobilize immediate response from authorities far beyond their jurisdiction. Outside in the station bullpen, officers gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones. The initial assumptions about a confused elderly man had evaporated, replaced by speculation about who Raymond Nash really was and what he had been carrying so carefully in his battered old truck. Through the office window, Raymond could see their questioning glance. He remained composed, his hands resting calmly on his knees. The wooden box now sat on Captain Monroe's desk between them, a bridge between worlds most never knew existed. Mr. Nash, Reynolds said finally, it seems we've made a significant error in how we've handled this situation. Raymond shook his head slightly. You did your job, Captain, and I did mine. Would you like some coffee while we wait? Reynolds offered, his tone now respectful, perhaps even slightly apologetic. Black, if you have it, Raymond replied. It's been a long drive. As midnight approached, the station's atmosphere had transformed from routine to tense anticipation. Every officer sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary, though none could articulate exactly what. Security protocols had been enhanced, the building secured, and Raymond Nash, no longer a suspect but not quite an honored guest, waited patiently for the arrival of those who understood the true significance of his mission. Have you ever seen a good person detained because of suspicion? Type, I've seen it. If you've witnessed something similar, at precisely 12:38 a.m., the station's perimeter sensors activated. Officers manning the security cameras watched with growing astonishment as 6 identical black SUVs with military markings entered the parking lot in perfect formation, surrounding the building with tactical precision. No sirens, no flashing lights, just the disciplined efficiency of a well-orchestrated military operation. The vehicle's headlights switched off simultaneously, plunging the scene back into darkness, broken only by the station's exterior lighting. Doors opened in unison and uniformed personnel emerged, creating a secure perimeter with practiced movements that suggested far more than routine military police work. Each individual moved with coordinated purpose, establishing positions that effectively sealed all exits and entrances to the building. Inside the station, officers gathered around monitors, watching the silent deployment with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. The night dispatcher attempted radio contact but received only a terse response. Secure channel established. Stand by for senior officer. What the hell is this? Muttered one of the younger officers. Some kind of training exercise. A veteran sergeant shook his head slowly. No training I've ever seen. Those are Joint Special Operations insignias. Whatever this is, it's way above our pay grade. Captain Monroe straightened his uniform and instructed his officers to stand at attention. Whatever was happening transcended normal protocol. The front doors opened to admit 3 individuals, 2 military police officers flanking a distinguished man in his 60s wearing the uniform of a 3-star general. General Elias Ward, United States Marine Corps, he announced to the officer at the front desk, presenting credentials that immediately commanded complete cooperation. I understand you're holding Raymond Nash in a wooden box he brought to your station. Yes, sir, the desk sergeant replied. Captain Monroe is with Mr. Nash in his office. The item is secured. Take me to them immediately. As the general was escorted through the station, every officer present stood at attention, sensing the gravity of the moment. When he entered the captain's office, his eyes went immediately to Raymond, who had risen to his feet with a smooth motion that belied his age. What happened next astonished everyone present. The general, a man who commanded thousands and advised presidents, approached Raymond Nash and rendered a formal military salute. Commander Nash, he said with unmistakable respect, it's an honor, sir. Raymond returned the salute with flawless precision. The honor is mine, General, though I haven't been commander in almost 50 years. Captain Monroe and his officers exchanged bewildered glances. The elderly man they had detained, the quiet figure in worn clothes driving an ancient pickup truck, was being addressed with deference by one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military. The general turned to Captain Monroe. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, Captain, but this matter involves national security protocols established during the Vietnam conflict. May we use your conference room? I need to debrief Commander Nash properly. 20 minutes later, the station's largest conference room had been transformed. Maps were spread across the table, classified files opened, and recording equipment disabled. The wooden box sat at the center, now open to reveal the insignia that had triggered such an extraordinary response. The general addressed the assembled officers, Raymond sitting quietly at his side. What I'm about to tell you is classified, but given the circumstances, you deserve to understand the significance of tonight's events. He gestured toward Raymond. This man before you is Raymond Nash, former commander of Shadow Echo Unit, a special operations team that officially never existed. In 1975, during the fall of Saigon, his unit was tasked with a classified extraction mission that went catastrophically wrong. The room was completely silent, all eyes moving between the general and the elderly man who sat with quiet dignity beside him. Commander Nash was the only survivor of a mission that saved 37 lives but cost 11 of his men there. Before evacuation, he recovered the unit insignia, the one in this box, and made a solemn promise to the families of his fallen comrades that he would one day ensure proper recognition of their sacrifice when classified protocols permitted. The general lifted the insignia carefully. This emblem contains embedded microfilm documentation of the mission and the names of those who served, information that remained classified until Operation Silverline was declassified just 3 weeks ago. He turned to Raymond. Your son, Colonel Nathaniel Nash, continued your fight for recognition. Before his death last year in a classified operation, he finally secured authorization for the Silverline protocols to be activated. The letter he left you contained the necessary authentication code. Raymond's eyes showed the first hint of emotion, a father's pride and grief intermingled. Nathaniel always understood duty, he said quietly. The general addressed Captain Monroe directly. Your officers didn't stop a confused old man tonight, Cap. They intercepted a final mission by one of the most decorated covert operators in American military history. A man honoring a promise to his fallen brothers that has spanned nearly 5 decades. The young officer who had initially detained Raymond stepped forward. Sir, I need to apologize to Nash. If I had known, Raymond raised his hand gently. You did your duty, son. I've never faulted anyone for that. The general nodded. Commander Nash wasn't acting for personal recognition. He was fulfilling the sacred pact between warriors that we never leave anyone behind, not even in memory. Every officer in the room stood at attention now, understanding washing over them. The man they had handcuffed and processed through their system was someone who had carried a burden of honor longer than most of them had been alive. Today, the general continued, we didn't come to take someone into custody. We came to escort Commander Nash to Andrews Air Force Base, where tomorrow morning the President will formally recognize the Shadow Echo unit and present Commander Nash with the honors his men earned with their sacrifice. As Raymond rose to leave, Captain Monroe stepped forward. Sir, we'd be honored to provide a police escort for your journey. Raymond smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. That won't be necessary, Captain, but there is one thing. Anything. I'd like to drive my own truck to Andrews. It's carried me this far. Seems right it should finish the journey. The general laughed. That can be arranged, Commander. That old GMC has earned its place in this story too. As Raymond walked through the station toward the exit, every officer present lined the hallway, standing at attention. The elderly man in simple clothes moved among them with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed external validation to know his own worth. A warrior completing one final mission with the same dedication that had defined his entire life. Type justice if you feel the right thing was finally recognized. 1 week later, local and national media outlets carried the story. Oldest truck in county belongs to secret war hero, former Shadow Echo commander honored by military after 47 years. The ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base had been both solemn and celebratory, a long-delayed recognition of sacrifice and courage. Footage showed Raymond Nash, now wearing a formal dress uniform with rows of previously classified medals, standing beside the president as the names of his fallen team members were read aloud. For each name, a family member came forward to receive honors, many meeting Raymond for the first time, though he had carried their loved ones in his heart for nearly 5 decades. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the stooped, weather-worn man in faded clothes. In his place stood a warrior whose bearing had returned with his uniform, shoulders squared, chin raised, eyes clear and focused. Observers noted how the president deferred to him with unusual respect, listening intently as Raymond spoke quietly about each of the fallen men. Behind the ceremonial stage, Raymond's old GMC pickup had been given a place of honor, parked between 2 gleaming military vehicles. Someone had carefully washed and polished it for the occasion, though Raymond had requested they leave the dents and scratches intact. They're part of the story, he had explained. When invited to address the gathering, Raymond approached the podium with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his life. The audience, military personnel, government officials and families of the fallen fell silent in anticipation. Honor, he began, his voice steady despite his years, doesn't reside in ribbons or in public acclaim. It lives in the promises we keep, even when no one remembers we made them. Those simple words spoken by a man who had lived them so completely resonated through the assembly and beyond, to millions watching the broadcast. In an age of instant fame and forgotten commitments, Raymond Nash stood as a testament to a different way of being, one where duty continued long after the cameras turned away, and the world moved on. As Raymond stood beside the president, the weight of years slipped gently from his shoulder. He hadn't just kept a promise, he had preserved memory, loyalty and truth through silence. Some missions don't need approval, they need a heart that won't let go. After the ceremony, Raymond declined the military transport offered to him. Instead, he climbed into his aged GMC pickup and began the journey home, a military escort following at a respectful distance. Along the highway, people gathered on overpasses and along roadsides,
having heard his story. They waved flags and held signs thanking him for a service most hadn't known about just days earlier. In Mill Creek County, the return was more personal. The checkpoint where he had been stopped now featured officers standing at attention as he passed. Children who had once laughed at his war truck now watched it with newfound reverence, understanding that some things earned their scars honorably. The military presented Raymond with a special commendation for unwavering fidelity to principle in a changing world. More meaningful to him, however, was the small brass plaque later installed on the dashboard of his truck, inscribed with the words Raymond Nash, keeper of promises for 47 years. Perhaps most poignant was the quiet gathering that occurred the following Sunday. Without announcement or fanfare, the families of the Shadow Echo unit traveled to Raymond's modest home. They brought photographs, letters and stories of the men who had not returned, sharing memories with the one person who had never forgotten a single face or name. Together they created a living memorial more meaningful than any monument of stone or metal. In the months that followed, Raymond's routine changed little. He still drove his truck into town for supplies, still lived simply in his rural home, but something had shifted in how the world received him, and perhaps in how he carried himself. The burden of an unfulfilled promise had finally been set down. When a young reporter managed to catch him outside the local diner and asked what it felt like to finally have his story known, Raymond considered the question carefully before answering. "Recognition isn't why good men do difficult things," he said. "We do them because they're right, whether anyone's watching or not." As the reporter pressed for more, Raymond simply smiled, climbed into his truck, and drove away. A man at peace with both his past and his place in history, having completed the mission he had carried in his heart for almost half a century. Have you ever witnessed someone keep a promise their entire life? Some right things need no recognition, but still need to be done. Comment a moment that made you believe honor isn't in words, but in quiet actions. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where even the smallest right actions are told, so honor is never lost.